I've recently been obsessed with making pies, and by obsessed, I mean I made one pie, and then I went and bought a pie tin so that I can make more pies. What I love about the idea of making pies is being able to put whatever I want inside. I even want to at some point experiment with fermented fruits or vegetables in a pie. Last week I made an apple and rhubarb pie and it was pretty good. And since I made that pie, I've been wanting to make another one, but I didn't want to just make another apple pie. So I went to my local Asian supermarket and had a look at what kind of Asian ingredients I could use to make a pie. And here's what I came up with. Some of you may know what an Asian pear is, and for those of you who don't know, an Asian pear is like the sweetness and flavor of a pear with all the crunchiness of the freshest apple you've ever had. It is hands down one of my favorite fruit of all time. I got my hands on some Asian pears from Korea, which I plan to use as a base of my pie filling. And I'm taking inspiration from a Korean dish called pesuk, which is Asian pear steamed with Chinese dates and various other ingredients. For mine though, I chose to add Chinese dates, pine nuts, and cinnamon. First thing I wanted to do was get my filling started, and I know I probably should have got my pie crust mixed and resting in the fridge, but I wanted to let the filling properly cook, then cool off completely before I put it into the pie, so I should have enough time to make the pie crust afterwards and let it rest for an hour. I peeled and diced all my pears up into 1-inch cubes, and I tried my best not to get any of the tough core flesh in my pieces. I ended up with about 900 grams of pear pieces, and it kind of looked like I'm wasting a lot of the flesh around the core, but I'll go in there afterwards and nibble on those to clean them out. I would have liked to have used fresh Chinese dates, but they're pretty much impossible to get here in the UK, so dried Chinese dates will have to do. Before I started cooking though, I boiled some water and let the Chinese dates soak just to soften them up a bit. I cut them in half to spread them open, then cut them into thin slices. There's a very specific reason why I'm using this many Chinese dates, and it's because it's all I had left, and I forgot to buy some more when I was at the Asian store. So this many Chinese dates will have to do, but feel free to use more if you try out this pie for yourself. After cutting the Chinese dates and adding them to the pears, I also added about 150 grams of demerara sugar, a teaspoon of cinnamon, and about 100 grams of pine nuts. I mixed them up a bit before throwing it all into a saucepan to cook. I'm not too precise when it comes to cooking things like this. I'll just taste as I go and add whatever I think it needs, and also check the softness of the pears as I go too. My thinking was that if I cook the pears to just before as soft as I want, when I bake them into the pie it will complete the cooking and bring it to the final softness. About halfway through cooking I noticed a lot of liquid was coming out the pears, which makes sense to me since Asian pears are super juicy. So to thicken it up a little bit, I poured off some of the juice, mixed in some cornstarch, and then added it back into the filling and continued to cook it. And this thickened it up nicely. I also added some agar powder, which is sort of like gelatin, and will help keep the filling more like a jelly once it's cooled, which should stop it from spilling out everywhere on the plate. I decided to use a little less than recommended because I didn't want a completely solid jelly-like filling. I let the filling cook for a few more minutes, then turned off the heat and placed it on the pot to let it cool off slowly. And while that's cooking, it's time to make the pie crust. The other thing I love about making pies is just how easy the pie crust is to make. It's literally just butter, flour, a little salt, and a little bit of water. I tend to go with the rough ratio of 2 parts flour to 1 part butter in weight, a pinch of salt, and then I'll eyeball the water while I'm mixing. And because I'm pretentious, I'm going to use my stand mixer to do this. I already weighed out my flour, about 400 grams of flour, which is going into the stand mixer with a good pinch of salt. Then I'm dicing up 200 grams of cold unsalted butter. The butter has to be cold, otherwise this won't work as well. The diced butter is going into the mixer too, and I'm using the cake mixing attachment to slowly bring the mixer up to speed. Once a lot of the butter is incorporated, I'll start adding cold water, bit by bit. In total, you should only need like a couple tablespoons worth of water. I'm aiming for sort of a shaggy dry dough that, when compressed, will stay together just like this. I'll pour the dough out and finish on my countertop, using my hands to knead and compress it all into one ball. Then it's wrapped in plastic wrap, thrown in the fridge to cool off for about an hour. After resting for about an hour, it's time to roll out the pie crust and assemble the pie. I considered doing some kind of fancy pattern for this, but after my last attempt at even doing a lattice, I think I'll just stick to a simple top for this pie. So I divided the dough into 2 parts, one a little bigger than the other since the base will require more dough. Rolled it out until I felt like it was big enough to fit the pie tin, and then gently lowered it into the pie tin, being careful not to stretch the crust, but instead let it fall into the pie tin. I also want to mention that I literally ordered this pie tin and it arrived today, so this will also be the first time trying it out, and it has all these little holes in the bottom to allow the base to get nice and crispy too, so we'll see how well that works. I put the filling in and was kind of disappointed that I didn't fill all the way up to the top. At least now I know how much filling I need to make a pie in this tin. Kind of wish pie tins would come with like recommended amounts for crust and filling to make the perfect size pie. There's a free idea for the pie tin industry. I rolled out the rest of my pie crust and then laid it over top, then ran a knife along the edge to create a clean edge. Then I used a fork to press the edges to create this little pattern, once again keeping things simple. I also used a wooden skewer to poke loads of holes in the top to stop air bubbles from forming inside the pie. Did I mention the oven has been preheating at 190 Celsius while I was doing this? I also used an upside down skillet in a rack underneath the pie to act as sort of like a secondary heat source. Before going in the oven for 20 minutes, I'll brush some egg wash and then sprinkle some sugar over top, and then it goes into the oven. Like I said, I baked this for 20 minutes, but I also kept an eye on it just in case it became too golden brown. Once it was done baking, I left it out to cool before I cut into it, and this should help the filling set a little bit so it doesn't just spill everywhere. And to help speed things up, I actually put it in my dehydrator with the heat turned off, and this worked a charm. So at this point, it's just after dinner and it's time for dessert, and before the rest of the family dig into this, I'm gonna grab this shot of the perfect slice. And voila. I'm just kidding, this is the first slice. That was a pain to get out, but now that I have a little more room to work with, I was able to grab a second slice that looked really good. And this one I'll top with a little vanilla ice cream and attempt to do the thing in the movies where the person manages to get the perfect scoop of pie, which is actually almost impossible. First impressions were that this tasted just like Korean cinnamon Chinese date tea, which is one of my favorites. None of the ingredients seem to overpower each other, and the pear is a really subtle flavour that brings quite a unique sweetness. Overall, super tasty, and will probably be something I make quite often, especially when I go to Korea and can get a hold of fresh Chinese dates and good quality pears. And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, like this video and then subscribe if you're new here.